He thought he was inheriting a luxury penthouse, but no one told him the building was watching him back. A former Navy SEAL carrying old scars and quiet discipline was given one rule: live there for 45 days or lose everything. Strange accidents followed, polite threats arrived, and the only one who seemed to sense the truth was his German shepherd. As lies closed in and paper became a weapon, the dog's instincts began pointing toward something buried in plain sight. This is a story about loyalty, justice, and the quiet miracles that guide us when we are tested. If this story speaks to you, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Silent Pause, Steady Hearts to help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. The fire alarm screamed at exactly 12:17 a.m., sharp and metallic, cutting through the silence of the upper floors like a blade dragged across glass. For one suspended heartbeat, the sound did not belong to reality. It floated, disembodied, unreal, like a memory intruding where it did not belong. Then the lights went out, and the penthouse was swallowed by darkness. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the northern city lay far below, winter quiet and luminous, its streets arranged like a celestial board game the gods played when they were bored. Snow drifted slowly, catching the light in soft spirals, as if the world itself were breathing. Up here, above the clouds and noise and ordinary human warmth, the silence before the alarm had felt almost holy. Silas Kincaid reacted before thought had time to form. 40 years old, built tall and broad-shouldered at just over 6 feet, his body moved with the efficient economy of a man who had learned long ago that hesitation was expensive. His frame was solid but restrained, functional strength rather than exhibition. His back wide, his movements controlled. The olive-green combat shirt clung naturally to his torso, the fabric whispering as he pivoted toward the door. In the brief strobe of emergency lights, his face appeared carved rather than soft, skin darkened by sun and weather, the faint roughness of it telling stories of deserts, salt air, and long deployments. His hair was cut close in a tactical military style, dark brown threaded with early silver at the temples, and his stubble was short, disciplined, almost severe. His eyes, steel blue shot with gray, were fully awake now, sharp and scanning, as if war had simply changed uniforms. At his side, Ghost rose in a single smooth motion. The German shepherd was large, mature, and unmistakably a working dog even at rest. At 7 years old, his body was powerful without heaviness, long-lined and balanced, his chest deep, shoulders strong, hind legs coiled with quiet readiness. His coat lay close and dense against his frame, black along the back and shoulders like a shadow laid deliberately there, fading into warm tan along his chest, legs, and face. His ears snapped upright, tall and sharply attentive, and his amber-brown eyes fixed not on the flashing lights, but on the air itself. He did not bark. He never barked unless it mattered. The fire alarm continued to howl. The lights flickered once, twice, and died completely. "Okay," Silas murmured, not to the building, not to himself, but to the dog. His voice was low, even, carrying no panic. He had learned that fear was contagious. He reached for the door. Ghost growled. It was not loud. It was not aggressive. It was the sound of a warning that came from deep in the chest, restrained but absolute. Ghost stepped forward and caught the fabric of Silas's sleeve gently between his teeth, not biting, not tugging hard, just enough to stop momentum. Then the dog turned his head sharply toward the stairwell door at the far end of the hall. Silas froze. The air smelled wrong. There was smoke, yes, but not the heavy, choking scent of something truly burning. This was thin, chemical, artificial. And beneath it, faint but unmistakable to a man who had learned to read danger like a language, was another layer. Human. Sweat and fabric and something metallic, the residue of adrenaline. "Someone's here," Silas whispered. Ghost's tail was low and still, his posture rigid but controlled, his gaze locked on the darkened hallway beyond the penthouse threshold. The elevator indicator panel blinked once and went dark. Somewhere below them, a mechanical door slammed shut with finality. The building had become a maze. Silas backed away from the front door and followed Ghost toward the emergency stairwell. His hand brushed instinctively near his belt, finding nothing there, no weapon, no familiar weight. Civilian rules, civilian walls. He hated how naked it made him feel. As they reached the stairwell door, a shape moved at the far end of the corridor. Not rushing, not panicking. A silhouette, briefly outlined by the red pulse of emergency lighting, then gone again. And with it came a voice, low and almost conversational, carried on the stale air like a private message meant only for him. "You won't last 45 days. The words were calm, confident, amused. Then silence swallowed everything but the alarm. Ghost strained forward, muscles tight, but Silas rested a steadying hand on the dog's thick neck. His heart was beating faster now, not with fear, but with recognition. This was not an accident. This was not malfunction. This was a test. When the lights came back on 20 minutes later, the building returned to its immaculate self. The alarm cut off mid-howl, leaving an almost painful quiet in its wake. The hallway looked pristine again, cream walls untouched, art perfectly aligned, air smelling faintly of citrus cleaner rather than smoke. There was no sign of anyone else, no shadow, no voice. The fire department cleared the building quickly. A false trigger, they said. New system, happens sometimes. Silas nodded. He thanked them. He stood still and said nothing else. By morning, the city below had fully awakened. Snowplows carved neat lines through the streets. Sunlight reflected off glass and steel, turning the skyline into something almost gentle. From the penthouse windows, the world looked harmless. The lobby staff greeted Silas with polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. A few residents offered nods, quick and assessing. He was out of place here, too solid, too quiet, his dog too large and too alert for a building that preferred its dangers invisible and its problems outsourced. At the reception desk stood a woman in her early 30s, slim and perfectly styled, her hair pulled into a sleek knot. Her smile was practiced, professional. "Good morning, Mr. Kincaid. Everything all right last night?" Her tone was careful, as though the wrong answer might complicate her day. "Fine," Silas said, one word, neutral. He had learned long ago that saying less invited fewer angles of attack. Ghost sat at his heel, posture straight, eyes calmly tracking movement across the lobby. More than one person slowed when they passed the dog, instinctively wary. Ghost did not react. He did not need to. He simply observed, storing information the way some beings stored prayer. In the elevator, alone again, Silas finally let himself exhale. The steel walls reflected a man he barely recognized, a soldier standing in borrowed luxury, his uniform out of context against marble floors and designer lighting. He had survived firefights, ambushes, nights so dark they swallowed sound. And yet this place, with its polished surfaces and quiet hostility, unsettled him more than any battlefield had. When the elevator doors opened onto the penthouse floor, Ghost hesitated for half a second before stepping out, just long enough for Silas to notice. That pause was the moment that stayed with him. It was subtle, almost nothing, but Ghost had been trained to move through chaos without hesitation. For him to pause meant something unseen had shifted. Not danger, not yet, but possibility. A thread pulling taut somewhere beneath the surface of things. Inside the penthouse, sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors, illuminating the abstract painting that dominated the living room wall. It was large, expensive, and aggressively meaningless at first glance. Bold strokes, layered colors, chaos presented as sophistication. Silas had never understood art meant to impress rather than speak. Ghost walked straight past the windows, past the furniture, and stopped in front of the painting. He sniffed the lower corner of the frame, then lifted his head and looked at Silas. Just once. Direct. Intent. Silas frowned. "What is it, boy?" Ghost exhaled slowly through his nose and sat down, eyes never leaving the wall. Silas felt something shift inside his chest. Not fear, not certainty, but the quiet click of a door unlocking somewhere deep in his instincts. He had been chosen for this place, yes, but not because it was a reward, because it was a battleground that required someone who knew how to wait, how to listen, and how to trust a signal that could not be explained on paper. He moved to the window and looked down again at the city, now fully alive. People moving like pieces, unaware of the hands that nudged them. Somewhere in this building, someone had already decided he did not belong. Silas rested his hand on Ghost's head, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm. "Looks like we're staying," he said quietly. Ghost did not move. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and indifferent, as if nothing in the world were wrong at all. Silas understood then, with a clarity that settled rather than frightened him. The penthouse was not a gift, it was a proving ground, and the war had already begun. Morning arrived slowly at that height, not with noise, but with light. The sun climbed behind the city's steel spine and spilled into the penthouse in pale sheets, turning the hardwood floors into a quiet mirror. Silas Kincaid stood by the window longer than necessary, hands resting loosely at his sides, watching the streets far below begin their careful choreography. People moved with purpose, unaware of how small they looked from up here, unaware of how easily lives could be rearranged by forces they never saw. Ghost lay near the wall beneath the large, abstract painting, his body relaxed but never slack, chest rising and falling in an even rhythm. His ears twitched occasionally, responding to sounds Silas could not hear, and his eyes followed shadows across the room with the patient attention of an animal that had learned survival was a full-time job. In daylight, the dog looked less like a warning and more like a monument, black and tan lines etched with discipline, age, and memory. Silas dressed without ceremony. The olive-green combat uniform felt right on his body, as if it belonged there more than tailored suits or civilian layers ever could. He was not pretending to be something else for this place. If the penthouse was testing him, it would test the man he actually was. The meeting was scheduled for 10. The law office occupied the lower floors of a different building, older and more subdued, its stone facade bearing the kind of dignity that came from age rather than money. Silas arrived early, Ghost at his side, the dog's dark collar stark against his thick neck. The receptionist looked up as they entered, surprise flickering briefly across her face before professionalism smoothed it away. "Mr. Kincaid," she said, standing. "Mrs. Holt is ready for you." Marianne Holt rose from behind her desk as Silas entered the office. She was in her early 60s, tall for a woman her age, with straight posture that spoke of discipline rather than vanity. Her hair was silver, cut neatly just below the ears, and her face was sharp in a way that suggested clarity rather than cruelty. She wore a charcoal blazer over a crisp white shirt, black trousers pressed cleanly, and sensible shoes that had walked more courthouse halls than carpets. Her eyes, dark and measuring, studied Silas, not with curiosity, but with assessment. She glanced briefly at Ghost. "He's well trained," she said, not as praise, but as fact. "He's been trained to stay alive," Silas replied. Marianne nodded once, as though that explained everything she needed to know. They sat. Ghost positioned himself beside Silas's chair, resting on his haunches, gaze forward, posture alert. Marianne folded her hands atop a thick folder on the desk, her movements economical, practiced. "Edmund Vale was not an easy man," she began. "He built his fortune carefully, and he protected it obsessively. He trusted very few people." Silas said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence invited truth. Marianne opened the folder. Inside lay documents, neatly organized, their edges squared with meticulous care. "The will is valid," she continued. It was drafted 2 years ago and amended 6 months before Mr. Vale's death. There are conditions." She slid a single page across the desk. "You are required to reside continuously in Mr. Vale's penthouse for 45 days. You may leave for reasonable errands, but you may not vacate the residence overnight or for extended periods. You may not sublet, lend, or otherwise delegate occupancy. If you fail to meet these conditions, the property and its contents revert to the next legal claimant." Silas scanned the page once. "And who's that?" he asked. Marianne's lips tightened slightly. "A distant cousin, represented by aggressive counsel." Silas almost smiled. "Why 45 days?" he asked. Marianne met his gaze directly. "Because Mr. Vale believed truth requires time," she said, "and pressure." She reached into the folder again and withdrew an envelope, its edges worn, the paper yellowed slightly with age. "This," she said, "was not filed with the will." She slid it toward him. "It was meant for you alone." Silas hesitated before taking it. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, as though the words inside carried weight beyond ink. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was precise but unpretentious, the strokes firm, the spacing deliberate. "Mr. Kincaid, if you are reading this, I am dead. That fact alone should tell you that I failed to outrun my past." Silas's jaw tightened. "My son believed in service. He believed that standing between danger and others was a kind of prayer. He died wearing the same uniform you once wore. You were the one who brought his effects to me. You looked me in the eye and did not lie. For that, you have my trust." Silas's breath caught, uninvited, at the memory he had kept carefully sealed. A younger man's gear, the quiet weight of folded fabric, a father who had not cried, but whose hands had shaken as he accepted what was left. "I cannot trust men who wear suits and speak of law. I trust those who have stood close enough to death to refuse selling their soul. The penthouse is not a reward. It is a shield and a lure. Stay, watch, listen, and trust the dog. Some creatures remember what we choose to forget." The letter ended without a signature. For a moment, the office felt smaller. Ghost shifted at Silas's side, rising to his feet and stepping forward, nose lowered as he sniffed the air near the desk. He paused, then turned his head slightly toward the envelope in Silas's hand, ears angled forward. Marianne noticed. "Interesting," she murmured. "He's reacting." "He does that," Silas said quietly, "when something doesn't belong to the present." That was the moment, the one that lingered, unsettling and inexplicable. Ghost was not agitated. He was attentive in a way that suggested recognition rather than alarm, as though the letter carried a scent that reached further back than memory. Silas felt it too, a strange sense of alignment, as if a long-forgotten line had just been drawn from past to present. Marianne cleared her throat. "There will be scrutiny," she said, "from the building management, from the other claimant's legal team. They will look for reasons to disqualify you." Silas folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his jacket. "They always do." When they returned to the penthouse, the building felt different in daylight. Less threatening, perhaps, but no less watchful. The security desk greeted him with the same polite smiles, but Silas noted the way the guard's eyes lingered a second too long on Ghost, the way a clipboard was adjusted, a note made. Inside the apartment, Ghost moved slowly, deliberately, circling the living room again. He stopped beneath the painting, sniffed the frame, then the wall, then sat, gaze fixed and unblinking. Silas watched him for a long moment. "You've been here before," he said softly, not a question. Ghost did not move. The thought settled into Silas's mind with the quiet certainty of a truth long delayed. Edmund Vale had not chosen him by chance. The dog had not ended up at his side by accident. Threads were converging here, tightening, pulling him into a shape he could not yet see. Silas looked around the penthouse, the art, the height, the silence that pressed in like held breath, and finally allowed the weight of it to sink in. He had not inherited a home, he had inherited a position. And somewhere, someone was already watching to see if he would break. Ghost lifted his head and met his gaze, steady and unwavering. Silas exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "Let's see what they're hiding." The city below moved on, unaware that something old and patient had begun to stir above it. By the 5th day, the penthouse had learned Silas Kincaid's rhythms, and just as quietly, it began to assist them. The first complaint arrived before breakfast, slipped under the door in an envelope so thin it felt almost insulting. The paper inside was crisp, official, and politely concerned. Excessive noise related to an animal. Silas read it once, then folded it and set it on the counter beside his untouched coffee. Ghost lay near the window, chin resting on his paws, ears half raised as if listening to the building breathe. The dog had not barked once since moving in. Silence, Silas knew, was never the real issue. 2 hours later, the intercom buzzed. Building management requested a routine inspection, same day, same hour. Silas stood in the middle of the living room, sunlight tracing long lines across the floor, and felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the sense of pressure before contact, before something went wrong. War had trained him to recognize patterns long before they announced themselves. The man who knocked introduced himself as Blaine Mercer, the building's senior manager. He was in his mid-40s, average height, average build, the kind of man whose presence seemed designed not to leave an impression. His hair was a careful shade of sandy brown, combed neatly back, his jaw clean-shaven, his smile precise and practiced. He wore a beige-gray trench coat over a pale blue shirt, the uniform of someone who wanted to look neutral while holding authority just out of sight. "Mr. Kincaid," Blaine said warmly, extending a hand. "Welcome again. I trust you're settling in well?" Silas shook his hand, noting the grip, firm but brief, already withdrawing, as if Blaine preferred interactions he could end quickly. "So far," Silas said. Blaine's eyes flicked, almost involuntarily, to Ghost. "And this must be the dog," he said. "Impressive animal." Ghost did not move. His body remained relaxed, but his gaze sharpened, pupils narrowing slightly. He inhaled once, slow and deliberate, and then looked away, dismissing Blaine entirely. It was the kind of reaction Ghost reserved for men who smiled too easily. "We've had a few concerns raised," Blaine continued, stepping inside uninvited, clipboard tucked against his side. "Nothing serious, of course, just the usual sensitivity that comes with shared living spaces. Noise carries. Some residents value tranquility." "A dog breathing isn't noise," Silas said evenly. Blaine chuckled, as if indulging a harmless joke. "In a building like this, perception matters," he replied. "We pride ourselves on maintaining a certain atmosphere. A war dog, no offense, might make some people uncomfortable." Ghost's low growl rolled through the room, controlled and quiet, like distant thunder. Blaine stiffened almost imperceptibly. "He's not a war dog," Silas said. "He's trained." Blaine raised both hands, placating. Of course, just protocol." The inspection found nothing. It never did. Still, the visits continued. Notices appeared, emails followed. Legal letters arrived with alarming frequency, each one phrased carefully, wrapped in courtesy, their edges sharp with implication. Silas pinned them to the refrigerator door, not as reminders, but as evidence. A growing collection of paper weapons. Ghost watched it all with the patience of an animal that understood time differently. He tracked footsteps in the hallway, learned which elevators carried familiar scents, which ones brought strangers. He listened when Silas slept, his body angled toward the door, a living threshold. It was during one of those afternoons, when the snow outside softened the city into quiet shapes, that Silas met Hazel Rowan. She knocked once, then waited, shifting her weight from one boot to the other. When Silas opened the door, the smell of coffee drifted in ahead of her, warm and grounding. Hazel stood just under average height, her frame slim but sturdy, shoulders squared with a kind of everyday strength. Her hair was a deep chestnut brown, pulled back loosely at the nape of her neck, a few strands escaping to catch the light. Her skin was pale from winter, but healthy, and her eyes, gray-green, sharp and kind at once, took in Silas and Ghost with immediate curiosity rather than fear. "I figured you'd need this," she said, holding up 2 cups. "High-altitude living is dehydrating, or so they say." Silas studied her for a beat longer than politeness required. He recognized the way she stood, balanced, aware of her surroundings, not easily startled. That came from experience. "Hazel Rowan," she added, smiling. "I work nights at St. Mark's. Military background, once upon a time." "Silas," he said, "come in." Ghost approached her without hesitation, tail lifting slightly, the tension in his posture easing. Hazel crouched instinctively, offering the back of her hand for him to sniff. "Well," she murmured, "aren't you handsome?" Ghost huffed softly and leaned into her touch. Silas noticed. They sat near the windows, the city stretched out below them. Hazel talked easily, her voice carrying warmth without pressing for intimacy. She spoke of long shifts, of patients who held on longer than expected, of those who didn't. When she laughed, it wasn't loud, but it was genuine, the kind that softened the edges of the room. "So," she said at last, glancing around the penthouse, "what's it like living this close to the clouds?" Silas took a sip of coffee. "Feels like trouble gets here faster," he said. Hazel smiled. "Funny," she replied. "I was going to say it feels like a place where secrets think they're safe." That was when Ghost stood abruptly. He moved to the front door and sat, ears erect, body angled forward. His tail was still, not alarmed, focused. Silas followed his gaze just as footsteps passed in the hallway, slow and deliberate, stopping briefly outside the door before continuing on. Hazel frowned. "Someone you know?" she asked quietly. "No," Silas said. "Someone who wants me to know they're there." The moment lingered, heavy with implication. Hazel's expression shifted, not to fear, but to resolve. Whatever she saw in Silas's face told her this was not curiosity masquerading as danger. This was the other way around. "I grew up around people who hid things in plain sight," she said softly. "If you ever need a second set of eyes or someone to talk to who won't panic, I'm around." Silas nodded once. He did not thank her. Gratitude, he had learned, was best shown through trust. That evening, another letter arrived, and another. Ghost lay between the door and the painting, eyes half closed, listening. Silas understood now. The penthouse wasn't pushing him out. It was testing how much pressure he could withstand before he broke. He looked at the city again, lights flickering on like distant signals. "All right," he said to no one in particular. "I see you." Ghost's tail thumped once against the floor. Somewhere behind the building's polished smile, something cold was paying attention. By the 15th day, Silas Kincaid had learned the difference between pressure and presence. Pressure announced itself loudly. Letters, inspections, reminders that arrived with polite signatures and colder intentions. Presence, on the other hand, entered quietly and rearranged the air before a single word was spoken. Silas felt it the moment the elevator doors opened on his floor that morning, before he even saw the man step out. Cyrus Wainwright did not rush. He moved with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his schedule. He was in his early 50s, tall but not imposing, his build lean rather than strong, his posture immaculate. His hair was a disciplined silver black, combed back from a sharp widow's peak, and his face bore the clean lines of careful living. No stubble, no softness, just angles honed by years of measured advantage. He wore a navy suit cut close to the body, a charcoal overcoat draped perfectly over his shoulders, black leather gloves folded in one hand. On his right hand gleamed a dark signet ring, understated but unmistakably intentional. Silas stepped out of the penthouse doorway as Cyrus approached, his presence blocking the hall without overt aggression. Ghost moved with him, positioning himself half a step forward, body squared, ears upright. The dog's tail was still. His eyes were fixed on Cyrus with a focus that felt almost accusatory. "Mr. Kincaid," Cyrus said smoothly, offering a smile that did not reach his eyes. His voice was calm, educated, and faintly amused, as if this meeting were a formality he had already resolved. "Cyrus Wainwright. I represent a concerned party in the matter of the Vale estate." Silas did not take the offered hand. "You're early," he said. "I find it best to address misunderstandings before they grow," Cyrus replied. "May we speak inside?" Silas stepped aside, not out of courtesy, but calculation. If this man wanted to strike, he would do it with witnesses, documents, and plausible deniability. The penthouse door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded far louder than it should have. Cyrus took in the space with professional interest, his gaze sliding over the art, the height, the clean lines of wealth masquerading his taste. "Quite a setting," he said. "Mr. Vale always did enjoy elevation." Ghost moved closer to Silas, shoulder brushing his leg, a subtle claim of ground. Cyrus noticed, but pretended not to. "I'll be direct," Cyrus continued, turning at last to face Silas fully. "My client believes Mr. Vale was not of sound mind when he amended his will. Leaving such assets to a former Navy SEAL with documented psychological trauma is troubling." The word hung there, polished and poisonous. Silas felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the reflexive anger that rose when his past was reduced to a liability. He did not let it reach his face. "Funny," Silas said evenly. "I was told the will was airtight." Cyrus smiled again, just slightly wider. "Laws are living things," he said. "They bend, they respond to pressure, and courts take mental fitness very seriously. PTSD, isolation, an aggressive animal in residence, it paints a concerning picture." Ghost's lips lifted just enough to reveal the edge of his teeth. A warning, nothing more. Cyrus's eyes flicked downward for the first time, calculating. "I'd hate for this to become unpleasant," he said, "for everyone involved." Silas met his gaze without blinking. "It already is." Cyrus studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, as though confirming a private theory. "We'll be in touch," he said lightly. "Do take care of yourself, Mr. Kincaid." High places can be disorienting. When he left, the silence he took with him felt heavier than his presence had. Ghost remained at the door long after it closed, ears still forward, body unmoving. Silas watched the dog carefully. This was not fear. It was recognition. Later that afternoon, Hazel arrived with attention Silas had never seen in her before. She looked different when she stepped inside, less buoyant, more tightly held. Her hair was pulled back more severely than usual, her gray-green eyes shadowed with something closer to anger than fatigue. She carried no coffee this time, only a folded stack of papers clutched too tightly in her hand. "Sit," she said quietly, before Silas could speak. They settled at the kitchen counter, sunlight slanting across the surface in sharp lines. Ghost lay at Hazel's feet, his presence steady, grounding. "I recognize the name," Hazel said finally. "Cyrus Wainwright." Silas waited. "My brother," she continued, her voice controlled but brittle, "was an accountant, brilliant with numbers, too honest for his own good. He volunteered to audit the books for a charitable foundation, one that promised housing support for veterans." Silas felt something shift. "The numbers didn't add up," Hazel said. "Money moving in circles, donations vanishing into shell accounts. He tried to raise concerns. 2 months later, he was bankrupt, blacklisted. And 6 weeks after that, he was gone. Her hands trembled slightly as she slid one of the papers toward Silas. A news clipping, a familiar name in the legal fine print. Cyrus Wainwright. He was counsel for the foundation, Hazel whispered. He never touched the money himself. He never had to. He just made sure no one else could touch the truth. Ghost stood suddenly, placing his front paws on Hazel's knee, his head lifting to meet her eyes. She inhaled sharply, then rested her forehead briefly against his, drawing strength from the simple, unjudging contact. "This isn't just your fight," she said, looking at Silas again. "It never was." That evening, Ghost began to behave differently. He paced the perimeter of the living room, stopping at precise intervals, his nose skimming the floor, the walls, the base of the large, abstract painting. He circled back to the same spot near the corner of the frame and sat, staring. Silas followed his gaze. "What is it?" he murmured. Ghost did not answer with movement. Instead, he lifted one paw and placed it gently against the wall, just beneath the painting, as though marking something invisible. Silas felt a chill, not of fear, but of anticipation. The dog had been trained to indicate explosives, weapons, threats that left residue. He did not mark nothing. Hazel watched from behind, her breath shallow. "You feel it too, don't you?" she asked softly. Silas nodded once. "Someone thought paper was enough," he said. "They forgot about instincts." Outside, the city glowed with winter light, oblivious to the quiet alignment forming above it. Cyrus Wainwright had made his move. He had announced the shape of the war. Silas placed his hand on Ghost's broad neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath his fingers. "They started this," he said, "but they're not the only ones who know how to wait." Ghost's tail thumped once against the floor. Somewhere below, the machinery of money and law turned smoothly on, unaware that a line had just been crossed. Night settled over the penthouse like a held breath. The city below glowed in disciplined grids, light stitched to light, as if order itself were trying to convince the dark it belonged. Inside, the apartment was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as though the walls had learned to listen. Silas Kincaid stood alone in the bedroom, jacket off, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the weathered skin of his forearms, the faint map of old scars that never fully faded. Ghost sat a few feet behind him, posture composed, head slightly lowered, eyes fixed on the section of wall Silas had been staring at for the better part of an hour. The safe was invisible at first glance. That was the point. Edmund Vale had been a man who understood that the most valuable things survived by refusing attention. The panel was set flush into the wall behind a framed architectural sketch, its seams disguised with the care of someone who had spent a lifetime hiding intent behind elegance. Silas had found it by accident, only if accidents were allowed to include pattern recognition honed by war and long nights waiting for something to go wrong. He keyed in the sequence Marianne Holt had provided, numbers pulled from property records, dates that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been told where to look. The mechanism clicked softly, a restrained sound, like a lock admitting defeat without protest. When the door swung open, there was no rush of relief, no gleam of wealth. There was no money at all. Inside the safe lay 3 items, arranged with almost ceremonial precision. A slim external hard drive wrapped in oilcloth, a small black notebook worn at the corners, and a single folded letter sealed with wax that had cracked with age. The absence of cash felt intentional, a quiet refusal to reduce the truth to currency. Silas felt a tightening behind his ribs, not disappointment, but confirmation. Edmund Vale had never meant this to be a payout. He took the letter first. The paper was thick, the ink dark and steady, the handwriting careful without being ornate. It carried the weight of someone who had written knowing he would not be there to explain himself. "They will call it an accident," Edmund had written. "They always do. Falling is easier to accept than being pushed. If you are reading this, then I did not live long enough to finish what I started. Silas read on, his expression unreadable, jaw set. I found the trail too late. Money that pretended to help was only learning how to disappear. When I tried to pull it back into the light, the walls grew teeth. I have left you what I could, where I could. The painting is not what it claims to be. Trust the dog. Some truths leave a scent. Silas folded the letter slowly and placed it back inside the safe, as though returning a relic to its altar. He took the notebook next. It was filled with tight, economical symbols, arrows, numbers, shorthand that made sense only to someone who thought in layers. Dates appeared beside coordinates, names reduced to initials, dollar signs crossed out and replaced with words like transfer, wash, cycle. This was not the journal of a guilty man. It was the map of someone trying to prove guilt without becoming collateral damage. Ghost rose and moved closer, his nails clicking softly against the floor. He lowered his head and sniffed the open safe, then turned away without interest, as if dismissing it as already accounted for. Instead, he walked with quiet purpose into the living room, stopping beneath the large, abstract painting that dominated the main wall. It was a bold piece, expensive, confident, and empty at first glance. Thick strokes of color layered without narrative, chaos masquerading as meaning. Silas had stood in front of it before and felt nothing. Tonight it felt different, as if the painting had been waiting for him to understand the question before offering an answer. Ghost raised a paw and tapped the lower corner of the frame once, then again. Not scratching, indicating. Silas frowned and crossed the room. He knelt beside the painting, examining the frame, the wall, the minute imperfections that only revealed themselves when you knew how to look. He reached into a drawer and retrieved a compact UV flashlight. He carried more out of habit than expectation. When he switched it on, the painting changed. Beneath the visible layers of paint, a second language emerged. Numbers glowed faintly, precise and deliberate. Coordinates traced a path across continents. Account numbers appeared where color should have been, along with strings of symbols that matched those in Edmund's notebook. The art was not art at all. It was camouflage. Silas felt the slow, steady rise of something like awe, not at the cleverness of the trick, but at the patience behind it. Edmund Vale had hidden the truth in plain sight, trusting that those who sought only surface value would never see past the price tag. Behind him, Ghost inhaled deeply, nose pressed close to the frame. He moved along its edge, pausing at one corner, then the other. At a point just above the floor, he stopped and let out a low, uncertain sound. Not a growl, not a whine, but something in between. He nudged the frame with his muzzle, then looked back at Silas, eyes intent. Silas followed the dog's line of sight and saw it. A faint smear on the wood, invisible unless you were close enough to doubt your own eyes. A partial print. Not recent, but not old enough to belong to the building's original installers. Someone had removed the painting once. Someone who had not known what they were holding, but had suspected it mattered. That was the moment when the room seemed to tilt, just slightly, as if acknowledging a shift in gravity. Ghost was not reacting to mystery. He was responding to memory, trained to recognize residue, pressure, human presence where it should not linger. He did not understand money or law. He understood intrusion. Silas straightened slowly, the weight of it settling into place. The hard drive, the notebook, the painting, none of it was meant to be found alone. It was a system, built to be deciphered by someone who knew how to wait, how to watch, how to trust signals that did not announce themselves with clarity. Hazel arrived later that night, her coat dusted with snow, her expression drawn but steady. She listened without interrupting as Silas explained what he had found, her eyes moving between the notebook and the glowing traces beneath the paint. She did not reach for any of it. She simply absorbed. "So this is why they're pushing," she said quietly. "Not because of the apartment. Because of what's hiding in it," Silas replied. Ghost lay down at Hazel's feet, his body pressed against the cabinet beneath the painting, as if guarding it by instinct alone. Hazel glanced down at him, then back at Silas. "He knew," she said. "You're Edmund. He knew they'd come." Silas nodded once. "He also knew I'd need help," he said, "and that I'd listen to the dog." They stood there together, the city humming below them, the truth glowing faintly on the wall like a constellation only visible to those who looked for it. Somewhere in the building, a system clicked on and off, elevators rising and falling, lives continuing unaware. Silas closed the safe and locked it, the sound final and precise. "This doesn't leave the room," he said. "Not yet." Ghost lifted his head, ears forward, as if in agreement. The penthouse no longer felt like a test. It felt like a witness stand. And Silas understood, with a calm that surprised him, that the most dangerous part of the war was no longer the pressure at the door, but the truth waiting patiently to be heard. Day 38 arrived without ceremony, wrapped in the kind of quiet that felt rehearsed. Snow clung to the edges of the city like a second skin, clean and deceptive, smoothing over anything sharp enough to cut. Silas Kincaid woke before dawn, not because of a sound, but because his body had learned when danger preferred to move. Ghost was already awake, sitting upright near the front door, his broad back straight, ears angled forward, eyes steady and watchful. At 6 to 7 years old, the German shepherd no longer carried the restless energy of youth, but what he had lost in speed, he had gained in judgment. He did not rise unless it mattered. The knock came at 7:12 a.m. It was firm, deliberate, and accompanied by voices in the hallway. Too many, too controlled. Silas opened the door to find Blaine Mercer standing just outside, clipboard in hand, his trench coat buttoned too neatly for the early hour. Blaine's face wore its usual polite concern, but there was a tightness around his mouth that hadn't been there before, a flicker of anticipation, poorly disguised as professionalism. Behind him stood 2 security officers and a man Silas did not recognize. The stranger was in his late 30s, average height, with a narrow face and thinning hair that clung desperately to his scalp. He wore a heavy coat despite the heated hallway, his hands trembling as he clutched his left arm close to his chest. His skin was pale, almost gray, and sweat beaded along his hairline. He avoided eye contact, staring instead at the floor as if it might offer absolution. "This is highly unfortunate," Blaine said softly, already stepping into the penthouse. "We've had a serious incident." The man behind him let out a pained groan and lifted his sleeve to reveal a series of red, angry scratches along his forearm. They were shallow, uneven, and suspiciously clean. "He attacked me," the man said, his voice cracking theatrically. "That dog lunged at me. I barely got away." Ghost stood at Silas's side, body still, posture neutral. His tail did not move. His eyes remained on Blaine, not the injured man. Silas felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not panic, not fear, but the cold clarity of recognition. This was not chaos. This was choreography. "Where did this happen?" Silas asked calmly. "In the east hallway," Blaine replied quickly. "Near the service elevator. Unfortunately, the cameras in that section experienced a data failure last night." Silas almost smiled. "Of course they did." Blaine's lips thinned. "Given the seriousness of the allegation and the potential liability to other residents, we have no choice but to initiate an emergency removal, effective immediately." Ghost shifted then, stepping forward just enough to place his body squarely between Silas and the man accusing him. His ears remained upright, his expression unreadable, but a low sound resonated from his chest, not a growl of aggression, but a warning of truth denied. The man flinched. Hazel arrived moments later, breathless, her hair still damp from the cold outside, her coat half-zipped. She took in the scene in an instant. The security, the trembling stranger, Blaine's satisfied restraint, and her eyes hardened. "This is a setup," she said flatly. Blaine turned to her with a thin smile. "Ma'am, please, no," Hazel interrupted, stepping closer. "You're going to listen." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, her hand steady despite the storm behind her eyes. "Last night," she continued, "I stayed here until nearly midnight. Ghost never left the apartment. I took this." She tapped the screen and the video began to play. The footage showed Ghost lying on the living room floor, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. A timestamp glowed in the corner. The hours advanced. Ghost never moved from his spot. Hazel's voice could be heard occasionally off camera. Soft, familiar, real. The stranger's face drained of what little color it had. Blaine stiffened. "That proves nothing," he said quickly. "The incident could have occurred earlier." "It didn't," Silas said. He crossed the room and reached behind a bookshelf, pulling out a small, discreet device no larger than his palm. He set it on the counter and pressed a button. A second video appeared on the television screen. His own footage. Silent, clear, unmistakable. It showed the hallway outside the penthouse door. The stranger appeared, alone, glancing around nervously, before dragging his own arm across a jagged edge of a maintenance cart. He winced, cursed under his breath, then rehearsed his scream. Hazel inhaled sharply. The security officers exchanged looks. Blaine's expression cracked, not fully, but enough. "Remove them," he said sharply. "Now." "No," came a calm voice from the elevator. The doors opened to reveal Detective Nora Vance. She was in her early 40s, tall and composed, her black coat dusted lightly with snow. Her dark hair was cut bluntly at her jawline, practical and unadorned. Her face was angular, sharp-eyed, with the look of someone who slept too little and noticed everything. She held up a badge, her voice even, unhurried. "Everyone stays." Silas met her gaze and nodded once. Nora stepped inside, her eyes moving quickly, taking in the devices, the screens, the trembling man now shrinking into himself. "I've been following a financial trail connected to a series of charitable foundations," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "It's been cold for years, until this morning." She turned to Silas. "The hard drive," she said. Silas retrieved it from the safe and handed it to her without ceremony. Nora accepted it carefully, as if it were fragile in a way that had nothing to do with hardware. Ghost moved then, padding past them toward the hallway. He stopped near the service door, nose lowering, inhaling deeply. He turned and looked back at Nora, then at Silas, then returned to the door and sat. Nora followed his gaze. "You're telling me the dog found something?" she said. Silas nodded. "He always does." They moved down the hallway together. Ghost led them unerringly to the security desk near the service entrance, where a night guard sat rigidly in his chair. He was a man in his late 50s, heavy-set, with a graying beard and tired eyes. As Ghost approached, the guard stiffened, his hand tightening around his coffee cup. Ghost sat directly in front of him and stared. The guard's composure collapsed. "I didn't touch the money," he blurted. I let them through. Turned off the cameras when they asked. I needed the cash." Nora's expression didn't change. "That's enough," she said, "for now." As the guard was escorted away, the truth seemed to ripple outward, cracking the polished surface of the building. Blaine Mercer stood silent, his clipboard forgotten at his side. Silas felt the shift. Not victory, not relief, but momentum. The kind that could no longer be stopped once it began. Back in the penthouse, Ghost returned to his place by the painting, laying down with a sigh that carried both exhaustion and resolve. Hazel stood beside Silas, her hand brushing his sleeve briefly, grounding him. "They thought paper would break you," she said quietly. Silas looked at the city beyond the glass, sunlight beginning to fracture the ice along the river below. "They forgot about witnesses," he replied. Ghost lifted his head, ears forward, eyes calm. The truth had cracked the ice, and beneath it, something long buried was finally breathing. Day 45 arrived the way some truths do, quietly, without ceremony, almost shy in its certainty. Snow drifted down in soft, patient lines, settling on the ledges and streets far below the penthouse, turning the city into something mythic and distant. From this height, the world no longer looked hostile. It looked small, intricate, like a story finally laid open so its meaning could be read. Silas Kincaid stood by the window before dawn, hands resting loosely at his sides, his reflection faint against the glass. The man looking back at him was still tall and broad-shouldered, still built with the solid restraint of a former Navy SEAL, who had learned long ago that strength survived best when it didn't announce itself. His olive-green combat uniform bore the quiet wear of weeks lived inside pressure, not battle. And yet it fit him more honestly than any civilian clothes ever had. His hair, cut close in its tactical lines, carried a little more silver at the temples now, though whether it came from time or from these 45 days, he could not say. His eyes, blue-gray, steady, deeply alert, no longer scanned the city for threats. They rested on it, accepting. Behind him, Ghost slept sprawled across the living room floor, his large black and tan body relaxed in a way that would have startled anyone who didn't know him. At 6 or 7 years old, the German shepherd had earned this rest. His chest rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm, his tail twitching once as if he were dreaming of open ground and familiar commands. The penthouse, once a maze of unseen dangers, had become territory, claimed, understood, guarded. The knock came shortly after sunrise. It was not urgent. It did not demand. It announced. Silas opened the door to find Detective Nora Vance standing in the hallway, snow melting into the dark wool of her coat. She looked much as she always did, tall, composed, angular, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and gave away even less. But there was something new in her posture, a looseness at the shoulders, a quiet satisfaction she made no effort to hide. "It's done," she said. Silas stepped aside to let her in. Nora removed her gloves, tucking them into her pocket, and looked briefly around the penthouse as if seeing it for the first time without suspicion. "Cyrus Wainwright was taken into custody at 4 this morning," she continued. "Financial fraud, obstruction, conspiracy. Blaine Mercer rolled fast once he realized the cameras were no longer his to control." Silas nodded once. He had expected nothing less. "The foundations are collapsing," Nora said. "Accounts frozen, shell companies exposed. It's going to take time to clean up, but the structure is gone." Ghost lifted his head at the sound of her voice, ears rising, eyes calm. He stood, stretched once, then trotted a slow circle around the room, as if confirming the news for himself. When he returned, he stopped in front of Nora and sat, tail sweeping once across the floor. Nora looked down at him, her expression softening despite herself. "You did good work," she said quietly. Ghost blinked, then turned away, as if praise were unnecessary. Hazel arrived soon after, her boots dusted with snow, her cheeks pink from the cold. She looked lighter today, the tension that had lived behind her eyes for weeks finally easing. Her hair was pulled back loosely, strands catching the morning light, and when she smiled at Silas, it was not tentative or cautious. It was sure. "So," she said, glancing around the room, "this is what the end of a war looks like." Silas considered that. "Feels quieter," he said. Nora left them soon after, duty calling her back to the world below. When the door closed, the penthouse seemed to exhale. For the first time since Silas had stepped inside it, the silence did not feel like anticipation. It felt like rest. Ghost broke into motion then, trotting through the rooms with unrestrained joy, nails clicking against the floor as he circled furniture, darted toward the windows, then back again. He looked, in that moment, not like a disciplined working dog, but like a king returned to his rightful hall, checking that all was as it should be. Hazel laughed softly. "I think he knows," she said. Silas crouched and rested his hand against Ghost's thick neck as the dog passed, fingers sinking into the dense warmth of fur and muscle. Ghost slowed, leaning briefly into the touch, his amber-brown eyes meeting Silas's with a depth that needed no words. Edmund Vale's words surfaced unbidden then, not from the letter, but from the understanding behind it. Some heights were not meant to be admired, they were meant to clarify. Silas stood and crossed back to the window. Snow continued to fall, each flake catching light before disappearing into the larger pattern. He thought of the man he had been 45 days ago, alert, guarded, convinced that survival meant holding the world at arm's length. He had not come here to belong. He had come to endure. Somewhere between the first alarm and this quiet morning, endurance had shifted into something else. Hazel joined him, standing close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm. Not claiming, not asking, just present. Her eyes followed his, taking in the city from this impossible height. "Are you going to keep it?" she asked gently. Silas did not answer right away. He looked instead at Ghost, now lying near the painting, his body angled protectively toward the wall that had once hidden the truth. The dog had chosen this place in his way. Or perhaps he had been brought here to finish what another had begun. "I don't think it was ever about the apartment," Silas said finally. "Or the money." Hazel nodded. She had known that already. The penthouse no longer felt like a cage. It no longer felt like a weapon. It felt like a vantage point, a place where lies could not hide behind height or polish, where truth could be seen for what it was, small or vast. Silas knelt again, resting his forehead briefly against Ghost's broad skull. The dog accepted the contact with calm dignity, breathing slow and steady. "Thank you," Silas murmured. "Not for protection, for guidance." Ghost's tail thumped once. Outside, the city continued its endless motion, unaware that one quiet battle had ended above it. But Silas knew. Hazel knew. And somewhere, perhaps, Edmund Vale knew too. The story did not end with ownership. It ended with belonging. Sometimes, miracles do not arrive as thunder or light from the sky. They come quietly, through loyalty that refuses to leave, through truth that waits patiently, through a steady presence that guides us when we can no longer see the path ahead. Perhaps that is how God works most often, not by removing the storm, but by placing something faithful beside us while we walk through it. In our daily lives, we may never stand in a penthouse above the city or face enemies hidden behind polished words. But we all know what it means to feel tested, to wonder whether we belong, to carry wounds no one else can see. And in those moments, grace often arrives in unexpected forms, through a friend, a companion, or even an animal whose heart listens more closely than words ever could. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of a moment when you were guided rather than rescued, then it may be worth sharing. Someone else might need that reminder today. Please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts or experiences, and subscribe to Silent Pause Steady Hearts so you don't miss the stories still waiting to be told. And wherever you are, whatever you are facing, may God bless you, watch over you, and place the right companions on your path. Quiet miracles, steady hearts, and the courage to keep going.